At 3:17 a.m. Moscow time, freight yards across western Russia slowed at once. Switches froze. Dispatch screens glowed red. On a network stretching more than 85,000 kilometers, the iron spine of the country faltered. This was not a strike, not sabotage. It was arithmetic catching up. A railway empire carrying coal from Siberia, fuel for armored columns, and food for Moscow's markets was buckling under debt measured in tens of billions. The largest employer in the country, with more than 1 million workers on the rolls, was suddenly short on cash, spare parts, and time. And then the unthinkable happened. Across 2025, Ukrainian long-range drones reached refineries, depots, and rail-linked hubs with ruthless efficiency. At least 96 successful refinery strikes followed, hitting 16 sites and roughly 38% of national refining capacity. Freight volume slid by 9.4%. Export routes collapsed. Rail debt surged toward £32 billion. Mandatory state loans became the only oxygen left. Inside the yards, wagons piled up. To the east, tracks lacked capacity. To the west, markets were closed. The pivot failed. Workers felt it first. Forced relocations from Moscow to provinces. Wages barely moved while official inflation hovered near 10%. Tariffs rose. Prices jumped. Kitchens noticed. Garages noticed. Shelves noticed. Fuel rationing appeared in Crimea. Domestic gasoline prices surged toward 80 rubles per liter in some areas. Repair times stretched as sanctioned parts vanished. Industrial cannibalism followed, one facility stripped to patch another. The shock rippled outward. Oil exports dropped by nearly 1/5. Frontline fuel availability fell by roughly 20%. Stockpiles of armored vehicles thinned. Aviation turned to parts scavenging. Manufacturing slid backward in time. A vast geography that once promised strength became a burden. And as the rails slowed, a question echoed from Siberia to St. Petersburg. If the iron network fails, what holds the country together next? The confrontation sits at the intersection of war, logistics, and industrial capacity. On one side stands Ukraine, executing a doctrine built on reach, precision, and cost asymmetry. On the other stands Russia, a continental power whose strength depends on moving bulk, coal, oil, steel, grain, across enormous distances. The battlefield is not only trenches and skies, it is rail yards, refineries, and repair depots. For decades, Russian railways functioned as the country's circulatory system. Highways cannot replace it. Aviation cannot reach everywhere. Tanks ride rails. Coal rides rails. Milk rides rails. Freight pays the bills. Passenger tickets never did. When sanctions tightened after the invasion, Western markets closed. The Kremlin announced a pivot east. China would absorb the volumes. The flaw was physical. Eastern corridors lacked capacity. Rolling stock was wrong. Sidings were short. Bottlenecks multiplied. This mattered because war amplified logistics. Armies consume fuel at scale. Industry consumes spare parts at scale. Sanctions severed supply chains for microelectronics, precision tools, sensors, and maintenance kits. Repair cycles lengthened. Output slipped. Ukrainian strikes then targeted the nodes that connect production to movement. Refineries linked to rail spurs burned. Ports feeding inland depots stalled. Each hit created secondary effects, measured not in headlines but in timetables and queues. History explains the fragility. Russia's industrial geography was optimized for Europe. Pipelines, rails, and ports flowed west. Reorienting such systems takes years and trillions. Instead, pressure mounted in months. Freight fell by 9.4% in 2025. Coal piled up without wagons. Oil products backed up without buyers. Debt ballooned. The state stepped in with loans, but loans cannot conjure parts or crews. Contrast sharpened the picture. Cheap drones versus costly refineries. Seconds versus months. A $500 platform disabling assets worth hundreds of millions. Small teams versus sprawling bureaucracies. Flexibility versus inertia. Even when defenses intercepted threats, the economics favored the attacker. Replacement timelines stretched, insurance premiums soared, export discounts deepened. Social context compounded the strain. Official inflation near 10% met wage adjustments close to zero. Forced relocations moved workers away from families. Labor shortages elsewhere hit 4.8 million positions as skilled staff departed the country. Unemployment fell to 2.4%, a misleading low signaling scarcity, not health. Imported labor filled hostels. Cultural frictions followed. Demand for antidepressants surged more than twofold. In this context, the rail crisis became a mirror. It reflected sanctions, strikes, and strategic miscalculation at once. When the system that binds a continent slows, every sector feels the drag. The question was no longer whether pressure existed, it was whether the structure could bend without breaking. The escalation unfolded in layers, each exposing a deeper weakness. First came the strikes that seemed symbolic. A refinery flare here, a depot fire there. Then patterns emerged. In August and September 2025, waves of long-range drones reached targets once considered safe. Tuapse, Novorossiysk, Ryazan. Facilities designed for redundancy found themselves offline at once. Tuapse's 240,000 barrel per day capacity vanished after a single night. Ryazan lost roughly half its output after repeated hits. Rail spurs feeding these plants sat idle, wagons stranded like abandoned shells. The second layer hit logistics. Freight schedules slipped. Coal exporters could not secure wagons. Oil products stacked up without routes. Eastern corridors clogged. Dispatchers rerouted trains into dead ends. Repair crews waited for sanctioned components that never arrived. Improvisation followed. Cannibalization became policy. Intact facilities were stripped to patch damaged ones. Each fix weakened another node. The network lost resilience by the day. Then came the human shock. Management orders forced Moscow-based rail workers to relocate hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. Families split. Housing costs spiked in receiving regions. Wages barely moved while prices rose. Official figures masked the squeeze. Markets told the truth. Butter required electronic alarm tags in major cities. Dairy prices doubled in months. Minimum wages lagged far behind shelves. Social media filled with images of empty pumps and handwritten ration signs. Twists accelerated the drama. The pivot to China faltered harder than expected. Exports from major firms slid sharply. Lukoil's shipments to China fell by roughly 69% as discounts deepened and logistics snarled. The money tap did not merely narrow, it cracked. Meanwhile, fuel constraints reached the front. Analysts estimated frontline fuel availability dropped by about 20%. Mobility suffered, timelines stretched, pressure mounted. Another turn arrived from the skies. Civil aviation, cut off from Airbus and Boeing parts, resorted to aggressive parts scavenging. One aircraft grounded to keep another flying. Winter weather magnified risks. On January 26th, more than 30 flights were canceled in a single day by the national carrier. Footage from November showed a regional jet suffering catastrophic mid-air component failure over passengers' phones, a stark symbol of industrial strain. Capacity across civil aviation shrank by roughly 30%, according to industry trackers. The military dimension added urgency. Stockpiles told a sobering story. From an estimated 13,800 armored vehicles at the start of the war, losses surpassed 9,200 by late 2025. Older platforms returned from storage, refurbished with mixed quality electronics sourced abroad. Components from multiple countries met inside aging hulls. Reliability fell. Tactics adapted downward. Lightweight vehicles replaced armored carriers. Exposure increased. Cold and wind punished crews before contact even began. The final twist struck labor. More than 800,000 skilled professionals left the country since the war began. Engineers, IT specialists, scientists. Defense plants absorbed what remained. Civil industry hollowed out. A labor shortage of 4.8 million positions emerged. Hostels filled with imported workers. Cultural seams stretched. Productivity lagged. Each layer fed the next. Strikes slowed logistics. Logistics hurt exports. Exports drained cash. Cash constrained repairs. Repairs failed workers. Workers lost faith. What looked like isolated incidents revealed a system sliding toward a synchronized slowdown, where small shocks triggered outsized consequences across a continental economy. The strategic impact landed across three fronts at once: the economy, society, and the military machine. Each fed the other. Together, they reshaped the balance of endurance. Economically, the numbers hardened the narrative. Damage from strikes on energy infrastructure was estimated near $74 billion across 2025. Oil exports fell by roughly 17 to 20%. Refining losses squeezed domestic supply while export discounts deepened. Rail debt climbed toward £32 billion, the deepest hole in more than 16 years. Freight volumes dropped 9.4%, starving the cash engine that keeps the network alive. State loans plugged gaps but expanded liabilities. freeze. Growth stalled. Real incomes eroded by an estimated 10 to 15% as price pressure outran wages. Society absorbed the shock unevenly. Fuel rationing appeared in Crimea, capped at 20 liters per vehicle per week. In some regions, gasoline prices approached 80 rubles per liter. Food costs surged as fertilizer shortages hit agriculture. Butter and dairy became symbols of anxiety, locked or alarmed in supermarkets in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Minimum wages lagged far behind shelves. Demand for antidepressants jumped by roughly 2.4 times, a quiet indicator of strain. Polling suggested about 66% of respondents wanted peace, reflecting fatigue rather than ideology. The military consequences were blunt. Fuel availability to armored units dropped around 20%, constraining tempo. Replacement cycles stretched as sanctions blocked microelectronics, sensors, and precision tools. Analysts noted that 70 to 85% of imported military and dual-use components now came via China, often at higher cost and lower reliability. Cold weather performance suffered. Failure rates rose. Production timelines lengthened from months to years. Losses outpaced replacement. Major outlets converged on similar conclusions. Reuters tracked export declines and discounting pressures. BBC and DW highlighted logistics bottlenecks and consumer impacts. Defense News and Jane's detailed stockpile depletion and the asymmetry between cheap attackers and expensive defenders. The pattern was consistent. Cost curves favored disruption. A small team with low-cost drones imposed delays measured in quarters. Strategically, geography flipped from asset to liability. When rails slow across an 11-time-zone state, coordination falters. Coal from Siberia misses contracts. Food misses markets. Fuel misses units. Inflation transmits along tracks. Central authority weakens when peripheries feel abandoned. The state's response leaned on controls, bans, rationing, loans, tools that stabilize headlines but not capacity. Industry faced a choice between shrinkage and dependence. Automotive production reverted to stripped-down models lacking modern safety systems. Aviation cannibalized fleets. Energy patched facilities with parts pulled from elsewhere. Each workaround reduced future options. Meanwhile, the labor drain hollowed innovation. A record-low unemployment rate of 2.4% masked a shortage of 4.8 million workers, a ceiling on recovery. The net effect altered doctrine. Time favored the side that could impose friction cheaply and repeatedly. Russia's traditional advantages, scale and mass, lost leverage when movement, repair, and replacement slowed together. The system did not collapse overnight. It ground down, day by day, under cumulative pressure. And in wars of endurance, grinding often decides outcomes more than spectacle. The global dimension sharpened the stakes. What unfolded inside Russia reverberated across NATO planning rooms, EU energy desks, Beijing's trade ministries, and Washington's security councils. The conflict became a live demonstration of modern doctrine. Attrition through logistics, not occupation. Paralysis through precision, not mass. For NATO and the EU, the lesson was immediate. Cheap systems scale. Expensive systems strain. A drone costing hundreds can disable assets worth hundreds of millions. Replacement timelines favor the disruptor. European defense planners accelerated air defense integration and hardened infrastructure. Energy policy adjusted faster than expected. LNG contracts extended. Storage targets rose. Insurance and shipping costs recalibrated routes. The alliance read the data and moved. The United States viewed the pattern through deterrence math. Industrial depth matters as much as battlefield performance. Production rates, repair cycles, and labor pools decide endurance. Comparisons sharpened between low-cost, high-volume tools and exquisite platforms with long lead times. Congressional debates shifted toward munitions output, microelectronics resilience, and supply chain security. The emphasis moved from singular marvels to scalable capacity. China occupied a pivotal position. As Russia's primary supplier of military and dual-use components, estimated at 70 to 85%, Beijing gained leverage. Prices rose, quality varied, winter performance issues persisted. This was not partnership, it was dependency. For China, the calculus balanced profit, deniability, and risk. Too much support invited sanctions. Too little weakened a buffer against Western pressure. The middle path dominated, enough to sustain, not enough to surge. The Middle East felt second-order effects. Energy markets priced in volatility, refined product flows adjusted, shipping lanes rerouted, defense buyers reassessed assumptions about air defenses and critical infrastructure protection. Lessons traveled faster than hardware. Comparisons between doctrines crystallized. Cheap drones versus costly jets. Modular teams versus centralized bureaucracies. Redundancy versus optimization. Ukraine's approach favored repetition and learning cycles measured in weeks. Russia's industrial response required quarters. In that gap, pressure accumulated. Scenario planning focused on the next 3 to 6 months. One path saw continued strikes keeping key nodes offline, locking in export discounts and fiscal strain. Another envisioned partial adaptation, improved defenses, selective repairs, modest freight recovery, without restoring pre-war flows. A third considered escalation risks and diplomatic probes as fatigue grew at home and abroad. Across scenarios, a common constraint remained: labor and parts. Experts quoted by Reuters, BBC, DW, Defense News, and Janes converged on the same warning. Infrastructure wars punish rigidity. Sanctions magnify time. Geography amplifies errors. The side that adapts fastest wins margin after margin, even without dramatic breakthroughs. For allies, the takeaway was sobering but clarifying. Resilience beats brilliance. Stockpiles beat slogans. Maintenance beats announcements. And in a connected world, the collapse of a rail yard can matter as much as a battlefield maneuver. The global system watched, adjusted, and quietly prepared for a future where logistics sits at the center of power. The picture resolves into a single shock. A war meant to project power instead exposed fragility. Refineries burned, rails slowed, exports shrank, debt ballooned, workers moved or tightened belts. Cheap drones imposed costs that expensive systems could not absorb quickly. Geography magnified every delay. The promise of stability gave way to rationing, improvisation, and dependence. Across 2025, the data stayed consistent. Freight down 9.4%. Refining capacity hit across 16 sites, 38% affected. Oil exports off by up to 1/5. Rail debt near 32 billion pounds. Fuel availability at the front down about 20%. Aviation capacity down 30%. Real incomes eroded by double digits. Labor shortages counted in millions. These were not talking points, they were constraints. The strategic lesson echoed beyond borders. Power in modern war flows through supply chains. Control the nodes, and time does the rest. Repeated pressure matters more than singular blows. Resilience, redundancy, and repair decide endurance. When systems optimized for peacetime meet wartime friction, they fail quietly before they fail loudly. Open questions now dominate the horizon. Can the rail network stabilize without access to parts and labor? Can energy exports recover while key nodes remain vulnerable? Can industrial dependence on a single external supplier avoid strategic capture? And can public patience hold as prices rise and mobility shrinks? The next months will test adaptation. Defenses may harden, repairs may accelerate, controls may tighten, or fatigue may drive negotiation. History suggests that logistics, not speeches, will decide which path prevails. What happens if the iron spine slows further? Will cheap disruption continue to outpace costly repair? Will dependency deepen or diversify? Share your views in the comments. Subscribe for ongoing analysis as this story evolves across economies, societies, and security. The rails once bound a continent.